This podcast is brought to you by Tethered. Now, with deer seasons winding down, it is a great time to take the plunge into saddle hunting, especially if you've been considering it. Maybe you've just wanted to try out the gear before you made a purchase. So with that, our friends at Tethered are always coming up with ways to help saddle hunters. And this year, they're doing the Tethered Teach and Train Tour, and it's hitting 20 different cities. And the session is 100% free to attend, where you'll be able to try out all their gear. So here's what's happening, or what is also included in the event. There's a free lunch or dinner, depending on the time of the event. All their saddle hunting gear will be in one place, so you can test absolutely everything that they have. And then there's going to be lots of giveaways and freebies. There's event-only pricing and discounts on Tethered gear. And then there's insider access on some gear, so you'll get a sneak peek as to some of the things that are yet to be released. Then there'll also, of course, be saddle hunting experts there available to answer any of your questions while you're hanging and trying out the different gear. So head over to tetherednation.com and check out the Teach and Train Tour page to see the list of cities and dates. I'm planning to be at the event on May 28th through the 31st at the Seven Springs Tack Shoot, so I hope to see you all there. The first thing I do in the morning before a hunt, before a scout, or just before getting ready for work is have my morning coffee, and I'm sure most of you out there listening are the same. Make sure you're filling your mug with Skull Brew coffee, as it is the only coffee company that is both 2% for conservation certified and donates 10% of its profits to conservation organizations to help secure the future of our wild places. So head to skullbrewcoffee.com and choose between 3 killer roasts of coffee and know that you are supporting conservation with every sip. Welcome to the Truth from a Stand Deer Hunting Podcast, brought to you by Skull Brew Coffee Company. I'm your host, Clint Campbell, and you're listening to episode number 166. Today, we are diving into another DIY Report look-back series with my good friend, the Bowhunting Fiend. So stay tuned. All right. What is going on out there? Happy Wednesday to you. Hope you're feeling well. Hope you are feeling fine. I am having a hard time here. I'm a little burned out, going to be honest with you, man. It's Sunday. This has kind of been the norm here lately. I've been doing these on Sundays because I've been spending Saturdays out scouting, and this weekend was no different. Had a trip plan that I had been looking forward to. It was a trip to a place that I've hunted in the past. It's at an undisclosed location, might we say, that I'm planning to head back to this year. And went down to put some boots on the ground, maybe try to find a few new setups, a few new areas, check some cameras, and was not disappointed. There are some big deer that have made it this year, and in a couple different locations. And this season is looking, at least in that particular area, is looking promising. So, the setting's big woods, and I won't belabor the points here necessarily. There's a podcast that I did with Chad and Cameron and our buddy Ryan, Chad and those guys from Exodus. That they'll be putting out on their Trail Cam Radio here in the next couple weeks, that we talk about what we had seen and what we had gotten into. So you can listen to that, or kind of the full rundown of what happened over the course of this weekend. But the short story version of it is that we headed to this piece of big woods, put in 16 miles ish over the course of 2 days, covered a lot of ground. It was really cool to be able to do it with be able to scout this area with 4 guys, because it's a really hard task for one person and even 2 people to tackle, just because the terrain's pretty rugged. The ridges are steep. It's nasty. There's a lot of hell holes that you kind of get dropped into that you have to eventually find your way out of. And maybe the sign was good, maybe it wasn't. Some of the stuff that we cover in the podcast when we kind of talk about the scouting and what we had seen and so forth is just in these settings how the nuance of things and the subtlety of the sign that you find is key, and picking up on that stuff will make or break your setups and your hunts and your understanding of the overall piece that you're hunting, and particularly in this regard. So there are big deer. When I say there are big deer, in some instances we're talking world-class type of animals, and you're not finding the sign that you would expect in these places. I've seen bigger rubs in some of the public that I've scout in Pennsylvania than I had seen in this place, and I promise you that there aren't any deer the size or the caliber that we had on camera in this particular piece of big woods. Um, I don't have those in PA. Let's just put it that way on the pieces that I'm hunting, and then I'm scouting and I'm finding bigger sign in those areas. But the cameras don't lie. They'd been out soaking for a better part of the year, and what we had on there was pretty killer. Which I think, talking about, reading sign and kind of scouting and understanding your setups, I think that ties in nicely into today's DIY report that we're doing here. So just for those of you that might be new to the podcast, this DIY report thing that we do is shorter versions of the podcast that I like to do, where we take maybe some, concepts or ideas that maybe you're helpful to kind of learn in smaller chunks. That way you can build upon them as you kind of go. And that's what the goal of this is. And this particular series is the Look Back series. This is something that the Bowhunting Fiend, Greg Litzinger, and I kind of came up with together. And it was, we thought, hey, we've had a bunch of guests on to this point. We've done now at this point like 165. I think this is 166 podcasts that we've done with a bunch of great guests that have dropped a ton of great knowledge. And so it'd be worthwhile to go back and kind of take some bits and pieces of podcasts that we found that were really interesting. Really, Greg kind of went back through and found kind of clips that he liked where someone said something that really caught his attention. And so what we do is we take those clips, I kind of set them up for you with a little prelude to kind of give you a sense of what that clip is going to talk about. We then play that clip from that guest. So in this particular episode, all three clips that we'll kind of dissect are from Dan Infalt. And then Greg and I, after that, we hear the clip, kind of discuss how we've, either used that particular tactic, how we may have had to adapt it, if we've had similar experiences, different experiences, and what our thoughts are on that particular piece of advice. It's made for some cool episodes in the past. If you've not listened to some of them in the past, I think if you go back to like the 130s of podcast, I think that's where some of those other look back series episodes are at. So with today's episode, like I mentioned, we're covering 3 different clips from our good friend Dan Infalt that's been on the show a couple different times with us. And this was from, I think, podcast episode number 16. So if you're interested to go back and listen to that, Dan drops a ton of great knowledge in that. That's where these clips are from. So if you want to hear the full version, you can check that podcast out. However, the 3 clips that we're going to focus on really is, the first idea is water is cover, which was really kind of interesting because, Greg and I had scouted in the podcast. He and I dropped together from last week. There's an area where, there is water, there is a lake, and I might have to have some water access to really get in it. And it's really what's probably going to keep that part kind of prime and huntable, if you will, because it's not far off of a road or far off the gravel that people could, really get to it if they really, really wanted to. So one is water as access. The other one is really kind of, when you walk into a piece of land, and really what we talk a lot about, is public land, that, some of these pieces, and they may even be sizable, but you really may only have 1 or 2 setups on them. And then you shouldn't really kind of beat yourself up trying to tear things apart and find more or create more setups than are really naturally available to you. Don't work marginal setups, look for really, really good setups. And if that piece of land really only has, or that property or that parcel only has 1, maybe 2 good setups, then you should hit those and you should move on. And that's the second thing that we talk about in this particular session. And the third thing we're talking about, I actually just kind of forgot what it was that we were talking about in the third one. So I'm going to have to grab my notes. We're doing this live here, folks. I'm going to grab my notes here real quick and try to remember what it was we were talking about on the third one. And it is, pause for a moment, please. It is, off wind. So the third thing that we're going to talk about and cover is hunting the just off wind. You hear people talk about it a lot. And it means different things to different people. And Greg and I kind of discussed that and what it means to us, how we implement that, and how we've used it. In my case, I used it, and I talk about it a little bit in this episode, how I used it in Iowa to kill that deer. So with that, we'll go ahead and get to the episode. But first, as always, I want to thank you all for listening. All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. Today, we are jumping into another round of the Look Back series that I did with Mr. Greg Litzinger. If you don't recall, or if you didn't listen to, I think it was around podcast 132 through to like 137. We did a couple of them. This is part of the DIY Report mini series that I do. The ones we did previously, you know, just to kind of give you guys a reminder of how these kind of work, is what Greg did. He did some homework, and he actually went back through and listened to a ton of podcasts that we had done over the course of, you know, the 3 full years that we've been going strong, because this is us going into our 4th year this year.
Pro bono, by the way.
Yeah, pro bono. Yeah, he was not paid for any of this. You know, as kind of like a celebration. You know, we've had a lot of great guests on talking about a lot of different stuff that, you know, myself and I'm sure a lot of you out there listening have been able to take bits and pieces from to add to our hunting tactics and strategies and help make us better hunters overall. And so kind of as a celebration, you know, Greg and I had this idea of like, there you go. Sing it, Greg. We had this idea that, you know, maybe we should go back
for everybody.
Shuffleboard. We thought maybe we should go back and look at some of the different episodes that we did where we had, you know, interesting conversations or brought up different topics that were interesting, and revisit them and kind of diagnose them, analyze them, talk about how we've used it in the past or how we might use it going forward, and just, you know, give a little bit more attention to some of those more specific kind of finer points of strategies that we wanted to touch on. So that's what we're going to do today in this session. So what we'll do here as far as the format goes is I'll kind of introduce what the clip is, or what we're going to talk about, and then we will actually play a clip from a previous podcast. And then once that clip ends, Greg and I will then talk about it, analyze it, and about how we maybe have used it or what we've taken. You know, it might be something that we've learned from that particular clip that we end up talking about. So that'll be the format for this. And on this first one is actually from, you know, a guy that we all know and love, Dan Infalt. And what he's actually talking about is something Greg and I covered on our scouting podcast that we talked about, is actually using water as cover. So we'll listen to Dan's clip, and then we'll dissect.
Now, if I'm looking at swampland or farmland or whatever, like around my home area, kind of flat, a little bit of roll to it. It's mostly farming. I'm looking for wet stuff. There's a lot of hunting pressure here. So I'm looking for wet stuff because the bucks are going to use water for cover. And I'm looking for dense swamps and stuff. And another reason for that is all the gun hunters will do drives. They'll do pushes. They'll cover every inch of dry land, and they'll kill everything. You know, when you look around my area, where I live, we've got a lot of hunting pressure here, probably the most in the state. And you can drive around on opening day and you see orange everywhere. But where you don't see it is out in those cattail marshes in the water or in the swamps. And those bucks gravitate to there. And I'm going out into the spots where nobody wants to go.
All right, so what Dan was talking about there was using water as cover in a lot of different ways. He, of course, is in Wisconsin. Dan is well known for hunting a lot of different type of, you know, terrain, but, you know, maybe best known for his ability to hunt swamps and marshes and stuff like that. And Greg hunts a ton of that, those types of areas. And then this last scout that we did, we actually found a piece that was similar to that we had talked about previously about, you know, access and how you might want to scout it, how you might want to use it. So, you know, I'm a noob when it comes to swamp hunting and stuff like that. And I've started kind of seeing how deer are using water for cover. I won't say I have a complete handle on it. It's something I'm still kind of learning and figuring out. But I know you hunt a ton of wet ground.
Yes.
Right. So talk about, I guess, like how you've seen deer use water as cover and how you kind of maneuver around that aspect.
For years, I mean, when I first started hunting, that's pretty much all we hunted. Canoe hunted. My dad was a big canoe hunter, so I just had a lot of time
right.
hunting around water, and deer will use it, you know, to stop humans from getting close to them. If you have a body of water, just say, you know, a creek that's a ditch that's 10 foot wide, 99% of humans are gonna be like, I'm good, and they're gonna stop at that point. Deer know that. They can smell it, they can sense it, and they will use those, you know, water to their advantage. Mm-hmm. In areas with, you know, coyotes, yeah, coyotes, or any type of like predatory animals, water will stop a lot of animals. You know, a good body of water will stop, right, you know, humans, predators from getting said deer.
Right.
You know, so they're not dumb. You know, water, it's protection, it's safety, and usually where there's water or some type of food, you know, there's good cover, there's browse, a lot of other things that deer need to survive and you know, thrive. You know, that. No, let me backtrack a little bit. Water equals safety, plain and simple. It's
Right.
food, cover, safety. So use it, take it from that, you know, aspect. Water will equal safety. You have a lake, you have main body, lake, creeks. If humans got to cross it, it requires effort and time. Deer know that. They're not going to, you know, for the most part, put in that much work.
Right.
So
there's one thing the one way I look at it too is two ways. One might be like a really novice way to look at it, but if there's a fair amount of water or a decent amount, enough of water in a particular area that someone has to cross or whatever. Let's take, for example, the lake that we were scouting around the other day, and where we think that there might have been bucks bedding out on some of those islands that weren't.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't like they were 100 yards out in the middle of this lake. It was like
50
25,
yards.
50 yards out, you know. And like you said, it's not a lake, quote unquote. It's really just a low-lying area that's probably not all that deep,
Yes.
right? But just deep enough. You know what I mean?
Rubber boots ain't going to cut it.
Right.
And deer know that because they're going to come up to their chest, and no humans aren't going out there on a regular, consistent basis.
Right. But we saw trails running into
Yes.
it, so it's not like those showed up for no reason,
Yes.
right? The other thing, the way I look at water too, is like if you've ever walked through it in a pair of rubber boots, what does it sound like?
Yes.
So before a predator would ever even get close
Yes.
to them, they're going to hear it far before they will ever see it. And if the predator has the wind in their face, be it human or otherwise, they're going to hear you before they smell you,
Yes.
like way beforehand, right? So that's the one thing I kind of think of is just like the sound aspect of it, right? Because it's like, how hard is it to sneak whenever you're in a wet area? It's like you almost want to give up because you're like, I can't hunt this. Like I can't even get in quiet, right? The other part that I kind of think of too is that when there's water there, you mentioned it with food. It's just like it seems to always naturally create a diversity of habitat.
Yes. There's
in an area.
browse.
Yeah.
And in pressure areas where deer will seek
An
out
edge.
water, yes, where deer will seek out water, you know, for cover, there's just browse. They don't need to leave said area until long after dark when humans are, you know, long since taking their flashlights and going home.
Right. Yeah. So I think the important thing to take away when we're talking about water is like, you know, safety, number one, right? It provides a diversity of habitat to where they can eat, drink, sleep, be merry in that particular area and have no need or desire to leave that spot until they know it is 100% safe. And then it's just a barrier from anything being able to get to them. It's like, it's almost the ultimate booby trap.
Yep.
Right. It's,
You got the thermal pool with water, you know, low-lying areas, the scents usually in the evening getting pulled down to them. You know, bucks know that.
right.
You know, I think even Dan talked about that, finding the balloons, you know, in the woods, you know, because thermals and everything that go to the colder spot, and you find a lot of balloons in the area. Odds are you'll find buck sign in said area.
Which is the balloon phenomenon that happens
Yes.
every year around this time when people are scouting. It's like, I found a balloon. It's a buck bed.
Yeah.
You know, I found a bunch of balloons last year. I did not see one single buck in those areas, but I did. Oddly enough, I did find some decent rubs in those general areas. You know, so I just think like the more you know, I've mentioned this in the past, like hunting swamps and marshes and stuff like that is relatively new for me. Growing up in like the more western part of Pennsylvania, and that being like where I grew up hunting, is more like ridges and, you know, hill country and stuff like that. And so it's taken me a little while to actually get used to and like swamp hunting or in wetland hunting.
Bugs.
There's also bugs, which I can't stand. But the one thing I will say is that in some ways, hunting water or swamp areas is easier in some ways. I think the wind and the thermals are trickier, right?
Yes.
You gotta watch your ass with that stuff. But I think figuring out where they're at is a lot easier,
Yes.
right? Because there's so much edge that's created. If you don't know where to start, just walk the edge because you're going to definitively see where that's at.
Yep.
And because it's kind of wet, you're going to definitively see like the tracks.
Yes.
And it's going to tell you like where they're spending time. And so now you've kind of narrowed down where you need to focus your energy looking, right?
Because they'll just walk just outside of the water's edge.
Yeah,
You know,
which
they're
is
gonna-
what we saw when we were.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it was literally just outside the water edge is where we found all that sign, and then we found the trail that looked like it was going out to the one group of trees that was 30 whatever yards off the side or out into the middle of the water, where we're like, that's probably where they're bedded.
Yep.
You know, so. Anything else to add with water for cover? Or are we pretty good on that?
No, water's fun.
Water's fun. Get wet, folks.
Yes. Chesties.
All right, this next session here, this next clip is with our buddy Dan Infalt again. This one, he's talking a little bit about, he's referencing hill country a little bit in this one, but what he's really kind of getting to is how to take a piece of land, be it public or private, but in this instance, he's really kind of referencing public, in starting to cross out anywhere that doesn't look like it's going to be suitable to hunt just from a access perspective. How easily can people get there? And then quickly being able to get to a point to where when you look at a piece, when you cross off all the folks who, or the access that people might have to get to the easiest places, it really only leaves you with a handful of places that you could possibly set up that you then verify. So we'll listen to this clip and then we will talk about and dissect the idea.
Like 10% of the hilly stuff I hunt has a spot like that where it's right next to the road and they're overlooking, watching the guys in the parking lot. You know, a lot of times if you can go in and then hook back around, a lot of times there's stuff up against the border of the road where you can't access from the road from that area. You know, and really what you got to do with a property like that is take a look at it and like look at the aerial of the topo and say, okay, where does everybody hunt? Okay, and you cross out 80% of that map, and you got 20% left. And now you say, what has suitable habitat for deer to be bedded there? And now you really got one or two spots. And really, most of my public land stuff on the hilly stuff, usually each property has one or two spots I'll hunt, and then I'm off to a different property. Where another guy might dwell on a property and hunt all over that one property, and a lot of it's wasted hunts. You know what I'm saying? I'm seeking out the one spot that'll hold a mature buck there. You know.
All right, so that was the clip. Again, Dan talking about finding those one or two spots, and you know, it could be larger areas or smaller areas or whatever the case might be. And it's funny, like we can reference the podcast previously that Greg and I did talking about the scout that we did together, because we exactly used this approach.
Yes.
It's like we looked at the map, we figured out like here are all the places people are likely to be. The one place that we looked at that we thought may be easier to access but probably wouldn't have a lot of folks was like on the back side of that lake.
Yes.
Right. And looked at that. And then there were two other big clear cuts that we wanted to go look at. And then at the end of the day, when we did that podcast, we were like, there's probably, you know, there's really three spots to hunt.
Yes.
Now we said it'll hunt big,
Yes,
because there's nobody in those clear cut areas, and you have a couple different setups in each of them, so you have multiple setups. But there's really only three areas in all that 3,400 acres that we found that we feel are between access and habitat and terrain were the three places that are likely going to hold bigger deer.
Yes.
Right.
Correct. And you know, and it's simple if you look at it from a bigger picture. You know, like Dan said, you break it down where your access fields, you just pretty much 86 that. You know, you're not really going to hunt that. You might catch a buck in there slipping from time to time, but odds are most of his daylight movement is going to be nowhere near those spots.
Yeah.
And we literally went to almost to the furthest part of his property, found the wettest, thickest, nastiest stuff, and we found buck sign, and a lot of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can almost take any property. Mature open hardwoods, I don't even, you know.
I mean, we breezed through that stuff. Like we just shot right through
Yeah,
and spent
you know,
zero time there.
Yeah, and
The only thing we looked for was sign along the edge of the thicket to see if there was a place where that was like, okay, I just saw a hammer rub. Is there a rub line there that we should follow in?
Correct.
That
you know,
was
and you can speed scout an area, you know, especially in that type of terrain. You had a lot of diversity. Now, if it's all mature hardwoods, it's open hardwoods for thousands of acres. It's a different story. You know, you gotta walk down and find it. But if you got cover, heavy brush, heavy dense brush, and browse, then you're good.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
good.
Exactly.
Just gravitate right through those areas, and you know, if you find buck sign, great. If not, on to the next piece. You know,
Right.
there's really nothing worth hunting there.
And I think my advice to people listening to this for this kind of stuff is, you know, because look, I think we've all been guilty of this, of romanticizing an area because it just looks so good and we want it to be good. You know what I mean? It's like we've all been there. It's like you walk into a place, you're like, man, this feels bucky. It should be bucky.
Feels bucky.
Feels bucky. You know what I mean? I don't know what that means, but it feels
It
bucky.
means something.
But the more the point being is that like we walk in and you're just like, this just looks like a spot that there should be a good deer, right? But if the sign isn't there, it's just not there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, don't waste your time on things that you can't validate with like with a visual,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And
Big
that-
tracks, big rubs, you know, a lot of scrapes. There's got to be something that says, hey, bucks come through here quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
A single random rub,
And if you're hunting on public, right, there's only going to be a handful of places on a piece, depending on the size and so
Yes.
forth, where that's going to exist, because it's going to be the pieces where people aren't willing to go.
it's a lot
Or-
of peas right there.
Yeah, places where people aren't willing. Yeah, it was a lot of peas. You know, it's going to be all those spots where people can't get to.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And or that is just too far, or there's water,
Too
which
thick.
go back to the
Yes.
last piece, right? Water is cover.
Peas.
Piece, yeah, another P.
Mm.
You know, but I think, you know, it was just interesting doing this because you and I just went through this and we scouted a lot of area and we did it pretty quickly. I mean, we
Yes.
started right around like 6:45 and we were done by like 11:30.
Yep.
And we
Yep.
hit everything that I think that we both felt was like, those are the good areas. Those are the good spots.
And we did a Hail Mary at the end looking for typical
Yeah, we did.
1/3 upper 1/3 buck bedding. and
point.
Yep, it was poop.
Squadouche.
Yep.
Yeah. You know what I mean? It's like, but the thing is like, you got to get out and look at those things. But I think to, you know, Dan's point, it's like we had those spots picked from a map
Yes.
because we cut out about half of that entire property saying like, this isn't going to be any good either from, you know, just, I had been on part of it at one point, was like, look, we don't even want to spend any time over there. The only reason we even walked to the fields, knowing full well that we aren't going to hunt any of that stuff, it
Just
was
see-
more of like, what food is here, right? Is it a big enough attract that it's actually going to draw deer like from far away? But once we got up into those couple places, like we recognized, yeah, hell no, there's enough browse here and enough food here that they're never having to leave.
Yes.
You know, so the deer that are actually in the area in which we scouted, other than maybe rut making their loop, probably are never going to make it down to that food source. It just wouldn't make any sense for them to.
Yeah, and if they do, it's, you know, long since dark.
Oh yeah, way long since dark if they're making that move. So when you're looking at these pieces, think about access. Cut out those parts where people are going to most likely get to
Look
with
for
ease.
transitions, edge cover, be it clear cuts, blowdowns. You know, use Google Earth and search in the wintertime and look for a possible thermal cover, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just anything different that's going to, you know, create diversity for deer to hang out in.
Yep. And prioritize those spots and go to them.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And don't waste your time walking through.
And like I said, if it ain't there, move on.
Yeah.
You can't make a buck just magically appear.
Right. Exactly. And I think a lot of people do that, right? It's like they get to a spot where it's like they want to be, and they just want a buck to be where they want to be. And that's just not how it works. Like you got
Exactly.
to, you know, go in and put the miles up. We walked plenty of stuff, you know, that we'll never see a deer in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, today. But we found enough good stuff where it's like, okay, this is a worthwhile endeavor. And out of all that we walked through, there were 3 spots
Yeah.
that were worth hunting, you know.
On 2,000+ acres,
Yeah. Yeah. So
3 huntable locations.
300 locations. Now we did say there's multiple setups
Yes.
within that, so you could spend a whole season hunting
Yes.
those 3 locations because of the size. But sometimes you might only find 3 setups worth hunting
Yep.
on a piece based on the size, how much access there is to it, where people are going to be, what the habitat is. So, you know, there's one piece of public that I know that I hunt that literally I know there's only 1 setup on it. That is it. I've walked the entire thing, speed scouted all of it. There is 1 spot that I'm willing to go in and hunt and spend a hunt on. Otherwise, I'm not interested in
Exactly.
it. You know, and you just got to be willing to do that. It's sometimes hard when you put time in.
Yes.
You know, it's like I just spent a day and a half, or a day scouting this thing, and I literally have 1 tree to get into. You know what I mean? But if it's the right spot, it's the right spot.
I've gone days, weeks of scouting. Basically, if you were to stack them together, and be like, that was pretty much just a waste of my time.
Oh yeah,
Literally, it's like, all right.
Yep, I did it a couple weeks ago. I walked this whole piece and walked right back out. I was actually hunting it. I was planning to try to set up for a late season hunt, and I walked the whole thing, and I was like, "There's not one spot I want to hunt that I want to hunt in this entire place." You know what I mean? And just jumped in the truck and came back home. I mean, I was hunting while I was walking. I was still hunting. You know what I mean? But it wasn't like a setup that had. There wasn't anything good enough for me to set up.
Exactly.
So, all right. So I think we covered the one spot idea.
Yes.
That Dan covered. So we'll move on to the next. We thought we were done with this one.
Yes.
But we're going to come back because after we stopped, we had another thought. I think you bring up a good point. It's like it goes back to like doing your e-scouting, looking at it. But people think that when you walk onto these pieces that you're right. It's like we could have just as easily been wrong today.
Yes. You know, you can on the paper it looks good, and then boots on the ground, you pretty much, you know, your e-scouting, satellite scouting, and boots on the ground, they need to be one and the same, basically.
Right.
You know, you can't have really one without the other and have success.
Right.
You know, we could have on paper looks great, and we walked in and been garbage. You know, or vice versa. We walk in, it's amazing. You look at it from an aerial standpoint, you're like, this is shit. You know, but when you walk, you're like, this is great. So, you know, what you're seeing from aerial photo needs to match, you know, what you're seeing in boots on the ground and vice versa. And sometimes it's not the case. You know, sometimes from the air looks great, it's not. You know, sometimes actually when in the woods, it's great, and you're seeing things that the aerial photos and top of maps just don't show.
Right. And I think a really good point from what we walked through when we were scouting was, you know, for example, if we looked at it just sheerly off of access, there might have been some of that we wouldn't even looked at because there were some old logging roads that were wide open that they clearly were bringing equipment through to like, you know, to log and stuff like that are wide enough for anybody to walk through and walk up, right? That weren't far from the places that we found that were really good, that weren't touched by humans, but those logging roads weren't actually on the maps.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And so it's some of that stuff that even like when you go into it going like, I'm cutting off everything where I look that I think there is easy access to. You still need to put boots on the ground and figure out if there's
especially if you got timber in the area because you don't know how old the maps are, if it's fresh logging, old logging, or they might be doing logging in the next year or two.
Yeah.
You know, so you don't really know until you actually, you know, spend a few hours in there.
Yeah. Yeah. So you always have to qualify the pieces, but that was the piece we left out that we wanted to jump back on and make mention. So
sorry about that.
All right. On to the next. All right. We have one more with our buddy Dan Infalt here. And here we're talking about something that you've probably heard him mention before, that you heard a lot of conversation about, and that is hunting the just off wind. So we'll hear what Dan has to say, and then we'll discuss.
I'm not locking myself into a tree because I don't know what the wind's going to be that day. So as I'm getting up there, I'm actually checking the wind with milkweed, and I'm not doing it at my truck, and I'm not doing it with the weather station because it changes in terrain, you know, from 100 yards. You know, it'll be different. So as I'm getting up there, I'm checking with milkweed and seeing what the wind's doing. And you have to have it a little bit off. You can't be, I mean, off by 10 feet or something because you get a little drift over.
Mm-hmm.
But you get a just off wind where he's coming around into the wind and you know, maybe he feels perfectly safe.
Right.
But you got the wind to your favor actually because it's blowing off to the side.
All right, so the just off wind. I think for anyone out there that is a newer or newish hunter, this is probably a noob, as I like to refer to myself in certain instances. This can be a little bit of a maddening topic, right? Yes. Because the whole idea is that, you know, you listen to people talk about, you know, hunting the wind, and, you know, I think people get the wrong idea that you're looking to have the wind in your favor. Like the classic example is, you know, I'm sitting in my tree and I expect the deer to come from the north, and so I want a north wind blowing in my face. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like it's directly in my face, so like he can't scent me. Yes. You know, and on occasion that will work, and you will have a deer tailwind, right? Mm-hmm. And that is probably on specific situations where he's coming from a particular area where he has to rock a tailwind at that moment to get to where he's ultimately getting to, right? So it's not like he's going to want to travel with that tailwind all the time. Sometimes it's whenever they're, you know, whenever they have a good visual in front of them, you know, they want that tailwind to check their six as they're walking into bed or whatever. Check the six, you know. So it's interesting because, I've said in the past that this, the Iowa hunt that I had was killer on many levels for me. Not even filling a tag out of it, but just like how much I learned on that trip. And one of the biggest things was this was like the year finally when like hunting the wind actually finally clicked for me and snapped and made sense, right? Every setup I had was with the wind in mind. And it wasn't that I was hunting the perfect wind. I was hunting, I tried to set up every day. And this was just really the first year that I was able to do it every hunt. Even when I was in PA, I did it.
Well, after 18 days straight hunting.
Right, yeah. But, I had great encounters all last year because I was actually was confident enough, I should say, to give the deer the wind.
Yes.
Where I was actually giving them the wind and almost sitting a suicidal wind, knowing that it was either going to be killer and I was going to have an encounter, or I was going to get busted from way far away, or they were going to get close and the wind was going to shift and I was going to get screwed. Right. And that was exactly how that hunt played out in October, or I'm sorry, in Iowa, where, I won't go through the whole thing, but the final setup that I had for that deer, I was expecting to get, I can't remember exactly. I think I was expecting to get some type of it was a southeast wind that was going to switch to southwest. And as it was switching to southwest throughout the day, where I expected this deer to come from I was basically going to be all but screwing myself. He had to come in a particular area for it to work. Otherwise I was dead, And so how I kind of framed it was I was riding that wind on a razor's edge, to where when he came in on this trail, he came in with the wind, what he thought was directly in his face. And I was cutting the wind, just cornering it just enough to where I had, like Dan was mentioning in that clip, I had like maybe a 10-foot margin of error, right? That if it shifted just a little bit, I was screwed.
Yep.
And as long as I had a somewhat consistent wind, I was going to be okay. And look, I had to wind switch a couple times. It was switching out of the east to the west, and
you're going to have that.
You're going to have that. And so, look, it's not a magic bullet. There were plenty of times during the course of that hunt, if he would have came in 10 minutes earlier, I would have been screwed because I had like 2 minutes where the wind switched.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And that's just something you got to kind of work with. Like, you're constantly dropping milkweed, and now if it's consistently changing on me and screwing me, like, I'm going to get down and I'm going to move, right? But I knew that I was just getting some switching because the wind was shifting throughout the day. And I was watching the weather on my phone as I was dropping milkweed, kind of timing everything. And I knew by 3 o'clock I was going to have that southwest, and that it was just going to be direct south enough that the west wasn't going to kill me.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And it worked out like a charm. He came in with the nose in his wind in his face, so he thought he got to 15 yards and caught an arrow.
Yep.
And that was, to me, was how I was working a just off wind. He was rolling, checking for does, right? And I know for you, Greg, it's like you're hunting a lot of that whenever you're setting up on beds and stuff too. So let's talk a little bit about that for beds.
Yeah, you hunt the wind that's best for him, not best for you. That's how I take the off wind. And a lot of my, I would say 90% of my spots is straight suicide. I get one shifting wind, the jig is up. But for me, it's the high risk, high reward, because that buck is bedded, in a certain location or coming through a certain location for a reason. It's safety, it's cover, and he knows that area. And if you are hunting it, what's best for you, odds are he's not coming through there.
Right.
And I remember back in the day reading Miles Keller, writing about that. You hunt the wind that's for the deer, not for you. And that means setting up on a blip on a trail or a blowdown where he has to go through something, and that's where you set up. That's that off wind where he said your little 10-foot margin of error, that sometimes that's all you got. Yeah. And that's the reason he's coming through there, because he knows it's safe. He knows he can come through here, and he's been smelling this all day. But you're just, if the temperature drops a little too fast, you're busted. If the wind shifts at the wrong time, you're busted. But high risk equals high reward.
Right. And I think it's interesting what you pointed out, because I left this out, but it was an important part of my setup, was like you're talking about using some obstacles to like understand where he's going to come through that sets you up to have that off wind. And that was what I did, where I had a draw to my back where I knew if they were trying to come down that area in that, in that draw to scent check anything, they were going to have to expose themselves because it was open.
Yep.
And I was like, they're not going to want to do that.
Especially an older deer, the deer that you're targeting. You're going to Iowa to target, you're targeting 4 or 5, or.
And also I knew, like, I had bumped the buck, and I think it was the same buck, out of his bed in that area the day before whenever I was scouting it. And so I had made the assumption that he felt safe in there.
Yeah.
Right. And so coming in there, he wasn't going to be on super high alert necessarily, because that's a safe spot for him. And I knew he wouldn't want to expose himself. And so I set up with that draw to my back with that wind that was just kind of blowing toward him, knowing that he didn't want to come too far to the, I guess toward the tree that I was in, because it gets kind of open. Yep. But all the thick stuff was over where he was going to end up walking through, and the wind was blowing in that direction. So he was like, I don't need to walk all the way over there, because I already got everything from the wind that I need. I can just walk right in. Yep. And that was his fatal mistake, was that. He would have been better off exposing himself in that draw. I had less of a shot opportunity there, and he would have nailed me right away. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? But otherwise, he came in where he had the cover, felt like he had the wind, and that was it.
You can be as scent conscious as you want, and Dan's not. Other people are. But hunting off wind, whether you're conscious of your scent, or not, is critical, because that deer, especially older deer, they're traveling, as safe as possible, even during the rut. Yep. Especially in, maybe not so much in Iowa as in here, like high pressure areas, because I've watched mature deer, will not move out of thick cover.
Even if that happened to me the day before, or 2 days before.
Even if the wind's garbage, they will just stop and freeze and stay in cover. If that wind shifts, they at least want to be in cover. If he exposed himself and that wind shifts and it's not in his favor, he's putting himself in danger. Mm-hmm. And that's what they don't. If they're going to break cover, that wind better be 100% for them, and even that's even sketchy at best.
Yeah. I mean, a good example of that is literally 2 days before that, when that deer that I missed twice, when I kept having multiple encounters with him. He came to that. I think I told you. I know I mentioned on the podcast, but he came to that little knoll at the edge of that draw whenever I was in a different tree setup, and I was hunting just off the wind for an area that I thought he was going to come out of to my left. Right. Well, he ended up coming out to my right. Right. And that was where I didn't want him basically to come out. Right. That was the one spot that I was giving up, because I was like, well, he's going to feel like he has the wind on this trail, but really I'm set up pretty good for it. The only way I'm going to get screwed is if he comes out a little high above me. Right. And the couple encounters I had with him, he never did that. But that was me watching a mature deer learn how he was going to use the wind there. Because he just stopped there, and he didn't get me right away, and he just kind of sat there and licked his nose. He
knew something was up.
Yeah.
He caught up just enough fresh human scent. He was like, all right, somebody's been in here. Let me just reevaluate this.
He would not come a step further, and what I basically realized was that little knoll. That was when I realized he lived there. Was because he knew if he stood there long enough, the wind would swirl, and it would pull up. And plus, pull just enough scent up to him, and he would
plus,
get me.
Those deer also, I mean, those older bucks, even smart younger deer, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, they are learning too. If they catch a whiff of human scent they never caught before, he's trying to interpret that for his own safety. So he's gathering all that data, like, all right, I caught human scent here. Why? So he's processing all these things at the same time.
Right.
And if he comes back in there again, all right, I caught human scent here, over here this time. And then he's just analyzing data like we do, and he's just processing things for he's learning as we're learning.
And that was what I watched, like with the multiple encounters, like he started changing his behavior.
And sometimes it's not much. A lot of people think you catch a human scent, the deer's going to run the next county over. They might only go 10 foot.
He changed literally 15 yards.
Yep. 10, 15 yards.
His entry point into that area was 15 yards different.
Yep. And
but it was thicker.
It's not much. And people think, oh, I bumped deer, he caught my scent. He's long gone. Not necessarily. Especially if that's his core area. He feels safe there. He knows every square inch of that. He knows, all right, I got here, I got to go over here because this is a safer, thicker cover.
Right. So I think the moral of the story here is that, you want to hunt the wind that's right for the deer and almost wrong for you. Is really what the takeaway is.
And that's a hard thing to do for people to accept.
Yeah, it is, and I'll be honest. Like it was until this year it took me to like fully commit to it.
Yes.
To where I was going. You know what? I'm gonna probably blow some hunts because of this, but it's also gonna be probably the reason why I kill one.
Yep.
You know, why I fill a tag.
Yes.
And it was 100%. 100% it. I mean, if you listen to any of these guys, whether it's Greg or whether it's Dan or whether it's Cody DeQuisto or whoever, it's like there's always moments when they get winded because the reason why they're killing deer is because they're running that wind on a razor's edge, because they're, especially some of these guys that are hunting like really, really mature deer. It's like they have to do that or they'll never see them.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? It's just like
and it's not, people think it's aggressive. It's not aggressive if you know what you're doing.
Right.
There's a big difference between being dumb and being aggressive.
Right.
There's a calculated aggressiveness will always win in the end. You know, it might take a few sits or a few seasons, but it's gonna
pay off.
Yes.
All right, folks, that is a wrap for today's show. I'd like to thank all of you for listening, and if you haven't yet, please head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast. And if you've not yet, hit the subscribe button on the YouTube channel as well. And before we shut this thing down, I need to give a big shout out to our partners who continue to help us make this podcast possible. Tethered, Exodus Outdoor Gear, Skull Brew Coffee Company, Gumleaf USA Boots, and Day 6 Specialized Gear. And until next time, we'll see y'all.